sitting and writing for generally about an hour.
Yeah.
And like going on 4 years now, like I can think of there's probably only a handful of days that I've missed.
Oh, wow.
And it's like for a bit there was a time that it was like, no, I can't miss it because then I won't be able to. It's like falling off the bike and then trying to get back on. And only like the last few months have I like gotten to the point where it's like no, it's okay. This would actually be pulling me out of something that I should be more present for, and it's okay to not do this today, and I can do this tomorrow, and it'll be fine.
Keep going. I wanted to kind of fuse something.
Yeah. But for me, it's probably been the single most effective tool for processing any experiences or emotions that I'm having is to just sit and write in a place that like it's not even I don't never even go back and read any of it. That's not what it's about.
Morning pages, right, Sam?
Yeah. It's about like the brain dump and kind of like letting the monkey in your head run itself ragged.
So I'm trying to find it, and I think they either changed their name or they don't exist anymore for the reason that I'm about to tell you. But there was a journaling app where you had to write 150 words a day. It was like their version of morning pages. Where they got into trouble was they had an, and I'm going to do this in air quotes, an algorithm that looked at the words that were used during this free writing space and then told you how you were feeling. And so then people basically started to subscribe to these beliefs because the algorithm told them to. But as with most startups, they usually start out shitty. And so someone I think published a paper that basically showed that it was actually doing more harm than good because it was relinquishing the people who used it of their agency in determining what processing looked like. It was basically outsourcing the processing part. And then thus kind of changing the nature of the work. So it was a really interesting kind of good attempt, but bad outcome.
It's really interesting because there's a lot of work in what they call like extended cognition in psychology that looks at like the effect of our use of technologies, like broadly construed. To like a book also includes this, right? To support our thinking, right? Like memory is faulty and not very good, so we write something down and then we have that information, right? And so in a way that is extended cognition, is the ability, we've outsourced our memory to pen and paper. But then as the years have gone on and things have become digitized, we've outsourced a massive amount of our memory to our phones, to the point that a lot of people do not even know the phone numbers of their parents or loved ones or grandparents or things like that. But people who are like in their 30s, for example,
don't know my wife's number.
You don't know. The only reason I do is because I put it on everything, because like when we get deliveries, a lot of times I'm not home, or the delivery drivers, I just have the delivery driver just call her, and they also often don't speak English, and so that can be difficult sometimes. So I've outsourced my extended cognition to her as well.
I'm surprised that you don't do what I do, which is have a keyboard shortcut that automatically pastes it in.
Oh, that's pretty clever. I haven't done that. I just remembered it because I guess I'm a Luddite. But this is one of those interesting things, right? Like when we were kids, like if you're even in your, I would say, early 30s, you probably remember your home phone number when you were a kid, but you don't remember and you knew the home phone number of your neighbors and your grandparents and your parents, but like you don't know the numbers anymore. And that's just like one example, and it makes me think, right? Like that is largely insignificant information in a way, right? But it's information that we've lost. And what I think is odd about reflecting about social media is that in social media we've kind of outsourced our sociality and our friendships to these social media platforms, where the information that we otherwise would have to hold in order to maintain and groom that social relationship and get closer with people is also outsourced. Like, how many people actually know their friends' birthdays anymore? Like, Facebook has that for us. We don't need it. It scrolls through. Like, as one of the things that I did years ago is I changed my birthday on Facebook to see if anyone would actually notice, and I had like hundreds of happy birthdays in January. My birthday's in November, but like it was interesting because there was a lot of like people who I considered really good friends too, and like I wasn't offended. Like I played the trick on them, right, in a way, but it was interesting to see which friends were like, today's not your birthday. And I even had family members being like, your birthday's not in January. Like, they thought I got it wrong. And I was like, no, this is deliberate. This is like an experiment. And they were like, oh, this is interesting. So, like, give it a try and, like, set your birthday for, like, next week on Facebook and see what happens and see how many friends of yours actually wish you happy birthday on the wrong day.
And then do it again 2 weeks later.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
so the
I-
other thing
so-
that I've done is I just don't do it on Facebook. And, like, it's interesting to see the birthday messages that I do get are usually they're from people who like it's usually like sort of the upper tier of social relationships that wish me happy birthday, because otherwise my birthday is not online on Facebook anymore.
Speaking of poorly manufactured hallucinations of reality, we had a growth hacker friend that figured out, and I doubt that this is still a thing that you can do, but they figured out that when you have a ClassPass subscription, you get like a whole bunch of free classes on your birthday. But if you change your birthday to say that it's tomorrow too, then you get it again. There is no like condition. So if there's a startup that you want free stuff from,
There you go, and you can do that. It's like, it used to just be free ice creams at TGI Fridays, and now it's the world. So this is something that I was thinking about, that like if we take this argument, we extend it a little bit further into like the hallucinating reality theme, right? The more time we spend on our phone, the more time that phone starts to affect our physical and cognitive reality, right? Like there's phantom vibration syndrome, right? People who think their phone is buzzing. It's some 90% of university students are reporting that this happens to them. Like, they're so addicted to their phones that they've hallucinated it. Now, this is interesting because there's another very similar cognitive effect for people who have lost appendages of phantom limb syndrome, where people physically feel that there's an arm that's not there, and they hallucinate the reality of an arm. And people are now hallucinating the reality of communication of people. Now, I'm thinking about this and going, okay, now let's take this to sort of like where we're going with this is like, if we spend 7 days in a dark room, we start to have different kinds of hallucinations and visions and things like this. If you spend time in a silence room, so when I was in Ireland, Queen's University Belfast has what's called an aoechic chamber, and it's a chamber that's designed so that there's no echo, there's no sound. When you speak, the sound just disappears, and it's very creepy. It's so cool. But when you put people in it, after like 20 minutes or so, they start to have auditory hallucinations. Your brain just makes up noise because it's not hearing anything and it expects it. And so it just starts making it up. Now, with all of these things combined, my question becomes like, what is virtual reality technology going to do to this? This idea of a metaverse. Like, we already have phantom vibration syndrome. We already have outsourced a lot of our sociality. What happens when we start outsourcing, like, not just like the link and the language and information we pass to one another, but like the very reality that we perceive visually and in audio to one another, not just like the spoken concept, but like everything that encapsulates the experience of those concepts. It makes me wonder the extent to which we're going to start hollowing out like our identities in a way, because we're externalizing so much of who we are socially into a server that like our bodies are not going to really feel like we have those identities in a very physical sense, I fear, and that we're going to start hallucinating identities. And I think that might be one of the things that we're kind of already doing, if you follow me, right? is that people don't feel attached to their groups anymore in the way they do. They don't identify with their communities anymore. And this has been going on since the 80s. And maybe what's happening is one of the reasons we're seeing so much degradation in our larger scale communities is because we have phantom vibration syndrome of our identity. Like, we feel like there's an identity there, but it's not really there because we've actually externalized it into so many other things that aren't ourselves.
I think this has been a problem even before technology, like imposter syndrome, and like probably since the beginning of mankind, just feeling like, who am I? Like, I know what I'm supposed to be within this society or the civilization that I'm in, but like, I don't feel that way whenever I'm sitting by myself. I don't think that this is a problem or issue inherent to technology, but interesting that technology could kind of strengthen it, yes.
Or even, at least even with different friends or in different contexts, we have different identities, the kind of multiplicity of selves.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know if
in
you
a
guys
way,
have
I
heard
think
of internal family systems theory. Have you heard of this theory in psychology? That we have all these parts, each of which is a kind of algorithm in a way that it in some way is connected to the bodily or procedural memories, and acts up under different contexts, in different relationships to different people. So what I hear you saying, Justin, is that we could, and we probably already are, we have been, developing different parts, to use that terminology, that react and engage with different sorts of virtual societies.
Yeah, I mean, we effectively start to hollow out our information. We hollow out our identities in a way. And I think Elisa's right. Like, the asking of this question is something I think that's very inherent to kind of like a human condition. And in the past, right, we've always had, like, as far back in human history as you can imagine, right, when we lived in small hunter-gatherer groups, we had our social contacts who could bring us back to the reality and answer that question, right? They, in a way, the context of who we were in relationship to the other people in our community answered that question, right? If you have imposter syndrome, right, you're going to find out real quick whether or not you are good at what you're going to do or not going to do, particularly in communities that are tied to the earth. Like, oh, I need to figure out if these plants are edible or not. It's like, you're going to figure out real quick how good you are at gathering food if you gather poison. Like, all mushrooms are edible. Some of them only once. This is like, I'm glad you like that, Sam. But I think, like, that's one of those things is like, oh, I feel like I'm an imposter. Everyone else says they're really good at like this, and I don't think I'm that great of a warrior. It's like, yeah, you're about one fight away from figuring that out, aren't you? Like, but nowadays we don't have those sorts of things. So much of our life is digitized, and the information that we utilize to define ourselves, is behind a login screen. But the one thing we do still have is our experience of our reality around us. Like, oh, it's raining outside. Oh, I ran into this guy at the store. Or, oh, I had this and that, and we did this and that. And that's still mediated with flesh and blood, right? But as a sort of virtual reality and metaverse system takes in, it makes me wonder, like, what happens when that server goes down? And like, there's no way to mediate those social connections. I mean, you can just see people when like Facebook goes down. It's like global news at this point. And I can't think of another website that when it goes down is global news outside of these social media sites. Like, CNN goes down, people are like, whew. Fox goes down, people are like, whew. Facebook goes down, everybody's like, oh, let's Google it, find out if it's really down or if it's just me. And it's like, oh, it's everyone? You're like, what are we gonna do? It's like my favorite, it's like, this is kind of a non sequitur, but one of my favorite things about the world today and where we are in technology is that when the power goes out, you tweet about it. People get on Facebook. Oh, the power went out, and they put Facebook on. When I was back in my day, we lit candles. Like,
if you ever want to see something really entertaining, look up the hashtag for earthquake Twitter. Because in LA, it's like the first thing that half of Los Angeles does when there's an earthquake is go to Twitter to be like, did you feel that?
I like there's an LA Quake bot on Twitter.
Yeah, there's a few of them.
That my favorite was what happened when there was in 2011, I was in Maryland. My mom lived in Sykesville, and there was an earthquake in Maryland. It happens very rarely, and it was a very small earthquake, and like people were like freaked out because they felt it, and a lot of people had never felt an earthquake before, right? Because it's just not something that happens on that side of the country. But then after everybody realized it was like the worst thing that happened is like the Washington Monument got like a crack in it, and like we had to send a mason up there. There was like there was still a mason, and he was like, yes, this is what I was training for. Somebody needs stonework. And then like they sent, and it's funny actually, there was like the official mason of like the U.S. monuments. By the way, I did not know this was a thing, but there's like an official dude. I assume he is free. I would like to believe that he is a master mason. In my mind, that's the way it works. It's very Dan Brown. But like looking into it, people started tweeting pictures of like a lawn chair flipped over, and it was like August 2011. We will never forget.
Oh no!
Like, because there's just like no damage done really. Like I realized how unprepared I was for an earthquake at this moment, because I was sitting on my couch and the dog started freaking out right before it happened, right? Which is fascinating because I've heard of so many instances of this happening that it's like pretty established that animals can sense these things before they happen. So I go up and I go to let the dog out back, and it's like freaking out, and then all of a sudden I feel the earthquake, and I'm like, oh shit, this is an earthquake. My first thought was that the dryer was broken, and then I realized that was not true. And then so what I do, right, I go, oh, I should stand in the doorway so that if the house falls, I've got a good chance. And I realized two things about how horribly unprepared I am for earthquakes. One, that's for tornadoes, isn't it? Two, that door led to the outside. I could have just walked outside. And literally 2 months after that, I got on a plane and went to Oxford. So it's not all kinds of intelligence that they need at that university. Earthquake intelligence? I don't got it. I don't got it at all.
So as people with PhDs, a weird qualifier, but because you both have advanced degrees in different sectors, how do you reconcile as an individual? Because I think there's an individual who I choose not to name, but that said we are already cyborgs. It's just that the bandwidth, meaning our phone, is really limited. And there's been a lot of kind of I guess in science of the past where like you look at the kind of neo-Darwinism that has arose back in, I want to say it was like the mid 50s, where there's kind of a divide in science, and then later you see like Lynn Margulis kind of saying that, okay, yes, there is the Darwinistic, the survival of the fittest, but there's also this symbiosis where there's these massive advancements in evolution because of like symbiotic collaboration. And so there's these frames that we collectively buy into, but then there's also the frames that we individually buy into. So what would you say on an individual level? Like, how do you reconcile these things? Oh, the point of the Darwinistic that was that it was just scary because it forced them to question who they were as individuals, as scientists. Because when you start talking about collaboration, then you start looking at things like holobionts, which Chantal and I, my wife, got married and said, you may now kiss, instead of the bride, or it was, you may now kiss the holobiont. Because a holobiont is a community of communities, and we've always talked of like, well, if you remove all the bacteria from our bodies, we'd be dead. We can't survive without it. It's a symbiotic relationship. Elise is losing. Just watching Elise.
I've got incredible trolls in my chat today. I'm just sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
So it's like, who are we, right? Like, we have to ask these questions. It's like, if you remove your phone, are you a different version of yourself? Well, yes. The question is, how do you define that? So, I don't know, do you have any recommendations, suggestions, or related science?
When you say reconcile, Brian, what do you mean? Reconcile individually? What, the fact that we are biological and cyborgs, or that we use technology? Which do you
it's
think?
the concept of self. I think is the thing that is the thing to poke at. It's like when you challenge someone's concept of self.
Well, some people reconcile that by going and spending 40 days in a dark room by themselves.
Right.
Yeah, I might be an outlier here. I think I'm quite happy with multiple selves, actually.
Well, but why?
Fluidity of cells. Why?
And how do you make someone who's not comfortable? Do they need to be?
I don't think they need to be. They may find technological advancements more challenging, more difficult. I mean, there's like any system that's stable, that has equilibrium, and needs to be open, but also have some form of integration. Any kind of complex adaptive system. So you don't, on the one hand, you don't want to be too rigid and have an identity that can't move and flow. On the other hand, if you just totally flow in all directions, you dissipate into nothingness. I mean, this is true for humans as well as it is for microorganisms or ecosystems.
I think it's interesting because so much of it has to do with boundary making, and it's the way that we defined the physical self is so much different than the way we define a psychological self. A physical self, right? We kind of just go, oh, anything that's within our skin bag is me, and that's that, right? Even though there's hundreds or thousands of types of like bacteria that live within us that we can't live without. We don't define ourselves by them, but we couldn't live without them. We just don't worry about it, right? We just say, look, this is our, it's almost like the police body on the sidewalk sort of tape out, where it's just like anything that fits in this box, that's me, that's my box. And you have that little personal bubble that you use to define a physical self with. But the way we define a psychological self, our sense of self is very much tied to our actual experiences and then reflection on that experience. It's the schema of information that we build about the beliefs and attitudes and values that we have as a person. But those beliefs, attitudes, and values, that schema that we have as a self schema, is always reflected or in reflection with different social groups and social contexts that we find ourselves in. And we know that, hey, if I am, being part of this group, if I'm in a context where I am this, right, then I should act a certain way. Whereas if I'm in another context, I can act another way. And there's a certain fluidity to it that works well. And so I guess to an extent you could say that like our self is like our collection of selves, but the ultimate realization, I think, is that there is no single self. Our self is always context dependent. I mean, people have said in the past, was that you are the average of your 5 closest friends. And to an extent, there's actually some science behind that, right? Robin Dunbar has shown that the number of active social network ties that you have sort of in any one moment is limited to a group of 5. And so, you generally only have 5 to 15 people that you're comfortable talking about personal financial matters with, for example, or borrowing money from them. You'd be comfortable having, asking someone to borrow money from them. That list is very small.
Wait, there's only 5 people that most people would feel comfortable asking for money from or receiving money from?
Asking for money from. Like 5 to 15.
That now? LaRon, will you give me $10?
Sure.
We're gonna break it down. So here's an interesting thing for Topia, right? To watch on Topia, because I've done this. Because Brian, you and I have done this at Drink in Burlington years ago when I first brought this up. Right, the human brain limits our ability to understand social groups and social communication because of the number of things we can keep in active working memory. Is basically 7 plus or minus 3. Phone numbers do the same thing. Anything that gets bigger than that, we have to start chunking it. But when you look at the number of possible connections in a conversation, if it's 2, it's just the 1 link. But if it's 3, it's the 3 links. But if it's 4, it's not just the 4 links. it's also all the links amongst the other people as well. So it's 6, right? And you're already at your 7 plus or minus 3. Once you add a 5th person, you basically hit that upper cognitive limit of how many social connections you can track in real time in your memory, in working memory, right? The sort of stream of consciousness memory, if you will.
RAM.
Yeah, your RAM, exactly. So you max out that RAM once you add that 5th person. So conversations tend to split to groups of 3 and 2, or 2, and one person gets on their phone. And so you see these things happen all the time. Now, what would be interesting, right, is because we're in Topia right now, and Topia works based on creating, communication links between our different feeds. It would be interesting for them to study the group sizes on their platform. How many people actually congregate onto Topia for any event at any time? I would be willing to bet an ungodly amount of money that conversation sizes are typically limited to about 5, and that if you actually look at, like, as time goes on, the probability that it's going to break down to 5 or less, like, number of people on platform is going to be less than or equal to 5, is going to become very high as time goes on, because those people eventually are going to drop out because of the cognitive load. However, you also, though, start to get super groups, because within those groups you can start to get subgroups, and those groups then start to move out, and they move out at a power law factor of 3. So you go from like 5 to 15 to 45 to 150, and you are going to start seeing those different numbers are going to start being embedded in Topia as well. And as it grows out to a platform, your average number is probably going to grow out to 150. And you're going to start seeing this, I think, for events. And as they start hosting more events, it would be very interesting to look at, like, sort of like actual active clustering, and clustering within the communities, and clustering in world, because you're effectively creating a proximity network, and you could analyze that proximity network the same way you would any other, like, geolocated network in a Euclidean plane. Once you cluster those things through, you're going to see an average total degree network size of less than or equal to 5. And that's all just because we're monkeys. It's just primate stuff.
Our
But
experience
that's
in
the way that we see it.
the tea house, when we start getting really busy with people, we do start seeing groups of 5 start to naturally split up. I would say, yeah, Justin, you're probably pretty accurate.
That's
and
awesome.
There's a few people that will leave. They've, like, communicated their boundary to us. Like, if the group gets bigger than 5, I will be leaving. No offense to y'all, but, like, my social anxiety starts to kick in when it's more than 5 people. So it's interesting. Yeah.
And I mean, one of the biggest correlates to anxiety is cognitive load. And 100% makes sense as to, like, why that is. I mean, I think, that's, I think, inevitably true for everyone. If a group gets to be more than 5, people are going to be more anxious, and the way they respond is obviously unique to every person. But just
some
that's math,
respond by
right?
engaging more strongly,
Totally valid. Yeah.
more intensively.
I mean, and
Yes.
who's ever tried to be at Burning Man with a group of more than 5 people and get anything? It's like,
I did once, and then people told me how rare that was, and then I was like, that's not true, and then we could never do it again.
yeah, like three is a great number of people for most. My experience, especially of being out at, like, large events like that, 3 to 5 people max. If you get bigger than that, you're just herding cats, and you're not. It gets to be frustrating for me.
At that point, you
is
just need to start having
one
leadership.
person that is in front with a giant, very bright lantern. That was what did it for 8 hours.
See, and that's the thing, right? And it's fun. A guy, we could probably get him on here, actually, if we wanted to. It's a guy, James Carney. He actually was a postdoc for Robin Dunbar and is a very close friend of a very close friend of mine. He and I would go out drinking a lot in Oxford together and stuff. He also does work in text analytics. He does aspect-based sentiment analysis. He would definitely jump on and talk to us. He wrote a paper on the emergence of hierarchy, social hierarchies, in relation to, like, priesthoods over history. And one of the things that they noted is that you can basically explain these hierarchical network structures based on that same pattern. Is that the way that you get above 5 is you basically say, look, this one person is in some way representing the rest of us. and that way you basically can go from 5 to multiples of 5, because you can have, it's very easy for 3 people to get there. And that's one of the fun things about that 3 number, right, is that it's very reminiscent of the saying 3 is a crowd. And I think, without evidence, the reason for the saying 3 is a crowd is because when you look at that network in the conversation of how many links there are in your network, 1 is 1, 2 is 1, arguably 2 could maybe be 2, 3 is 3, but 4 is 6. So 3 is a crowd because anything above 3 starts getting weird, because you have to start worrying about what other people think about other people. And it's just, that's, 3 is a crowd, limited to 3. So it's one of those weird things, and that could be they created a mathematical model for how you can basically create fractal and social groups, of like groups that are reminiscent of other groups that are embedded inside of one another, and you basically can grow a hierarchy that way.
I kind of want to change the subject a little bit. And by the way, my chat on Reddit is just gold today, so I do recommend all of you. I'll send the link for it. Y'all can go back and review it afterwards. It's hilarious. But
oh, for sure.
It's something related to what we kind of brought up before we started the stream was the kind of other turn you wanted to talk about. And people in the chat that are trolling us said that anything that we're talking about today is never going to get us on Joe Rogan. So I thought that would be... We're never making it on Joe Rogan. We're okay with that. But I figured that would be a fun joke to share with y'all to kind of turn the conversation to an area that y'all did want to talk about today, which is, misinformation on Spotify. Y'all wanted to talk about that, right?
Oh, for sure.
Cool.
Well, I'm always up to talk about misinformation on Spotify.
Maybe we'll get invited on Joe Rogan. Justin, that would be great if you got on Joe Rogan.
I have no comment. I would go for sure. There's friends of friends and stuff like that. Like it's a dream of mine that I would like to realize, and there's a pathway to that dream that I am working towards. So we'll see. We actually have LeBron and I have a colleague that we've worked with, Ted Slingerland at UBC Vancouver, who was on Rogan not long ago, and he kind of I think the technical term is kind of shit the bed. he started talking about Çatalhöyük and did this, like, there's this place called Çatalhöyük. I don't know if you know it. It was kind of like a hipster off the cuff response, and then Joe Rogan proceeded to go on for like 8 to 10 minutes about how he actually did know a lot about Çatalhöyük. And he knew the conspiracy stuff, but he knew some stuff that's academic canon, if you will, as well. And a lot of everyone like shared that and was like, Joe Rogan destroys Professor, and I'm just like, oh, dude, no. But I would go on there for sure. I got all sorts of misinformation for Rogan.
I mean, that would be the ideal, right? Like, you just go and start feeding him more misinformation. Just go and feed him total bullshit and see if he buys it.
One man's misinformation is another man's canon. I mean, on the one hand, I would love to do that, but on another, I think that it would just be so obvious at a certain point.
Yeah.
Would it?
I don't know. Would it? People still watch mainstream media, so apparently not. We have been feeding bullshit for a long time.
We have a stop coming up in 9 minutes. So how can we solve all of the world's conflicts and misunderstandings of self and misinformation in a sentence?
I have an idea.
Go for it, Sam. Yeah.
So a lot of what we've talked about is kind of how we surrender the agency about the inputs that go into our sense of self. We're surrendering that agency and decision making to algorithms. Mm-hmm. And it's not, you don't go onto Facebook to see what a specific person is doing today. You go onto Facebook to see what Facebook thinks is important for you to know about from your network.
Or you're a stalker and you did go on to see what the person is doing today.
But that's
very real option, Sam.
Right. So right there, it's like, if you want to go and like look and see what a good friend of yours is doing, you're a stalker. Because you're like specifically seeking out something about this person. And it's like, back in the day, you used to have to like pick up the phone and call somebody and be like, "Hey, what have you been up to lately? Tell me what's happening." And you had to like build these kind of like real relationships with people, versus just kind of,
or actually go to their house when I was young.
Yeah, which is and now that's super stalkerish.
Right.
So
OG
it's
Yelp,
like
everybody used to check in. We knew because everybody's bikes were in the front lawn.
Yeah, so it's to me it's really interesting the way that we don't really decide what information we get anymore. We let the algorithms know us better about what information we want, and it just makes us ripe for manipulation.
It does, and I think that that's also not far off from a lot of what we deal with today in the misinformation space, because when you look at a lot of what you see on social media, those flags are being put up automatically. And it's because their algorithms have said, look, this is a contentious subject. You know, we've decided that this is a contentious subject, and here's the canonical thing that we're going to give. And they put something from like a fact checker up there. Of course, the issue is that most of those fact checkers are not really experts in those fields a lot of the time. They're just organizations that are paid to do fact checking. And they are prone to bias as well. And that's one of the things I think that can be really problematic is, you know, particularly in an area of science, right? And the area that Rogan is currently in you know, the deep water for is misinformation about science is what people are accusing him of. And that issue is the fact that like science changes, right? Masks were good and then they weren't good and then they were, and then natural immunity does this and mRNA can do that. And you know, our knowledge of COVID happened in real time, and so it's problematic to say something and then not change one's view in light of new evidence. And I think that one of the reasons why Rogan takes so much heat is because, one, he does not hold factual opinions very strongly. When he says something, a lot of times, one, he says it like in the context of a comedian. I think the most problematic thing about Joe Rogan is the same thing that's problematic about John Oliver, is that they say, oh, don't listen to me, I'm a comedian. And it's like, on the one hand, obviously true. On the other hand, nevertheless, people are listening to you. So either speak as a comedian or speak as a pundit that's looking to make an argument. Don't do both, right? That's a Mott and Bailey argument, or, you know, bullshit.
Are we cool with ending the stream here? And then we can stay and hang out and talk by the fire?
Sure,
I can do.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. All of you, thank you. And Jack has already left, but Sam and Elise, your non-academic perspectives are very helpful to round us out, and fantastic.
Who are you calling a non-academic? I'm an academic. Come on, Brian.
I had a 4.0.
I wasn't using academic as a compliment, but mind you, Justin is the reason I didn't go on any dates with any academics for a decade.
And now look what happened.
Yeah, well, Chantel owes me one because I was saving you.
Thank you so much for joining, and we'll be back next week for everyone who's watching to talk about Joe Rogan, probably. That's all.
Misinformation.
It is misinformation.
Misinformation.
All right. See you.
Hashtag fake news.
See you, trolls.
All right, and we're out. Okay, you guys keep talking. I had to